happened when I set out on a journey from the busy streets of Brooklyn to my friend Alex's cabin in Vermont. We were planning a fun weekend of snowboarding. I had 2 cars, a shiny BMW 3 Series, and an old Ford F-150. This story is about the adventure I had while driving the Ford truck on a snowy night. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I was driving alone on a dark road covered in snow. The only company I had were the falling snowflakes. The road was mostly empty, and I still had about 45 minutes to reach Alex's cabin. I was excited about the snowboarding weekend, but also a bit nervous because I knew my old truck sometimes had problems. As I drove deeper into the night, suddenly, the engine temperature started rising way too high, and the red warning light blinked. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine was overheating, and I had to stop. It was pitch black around me, and the snowfall was heavy. I had my snowboarding gear in the truck bed, making things more complicated. I waited for the engine to cool down and started driving again, but the temperature went up quickly, and I had to stop once more. This time, I had to turn off the engine completely. I opened the hood and tried to figure out what was wrong, but it was difficult in the dark and cold. I didn't have cell reception in that area, so I couldn't call for help. Feeling a bit stranded, I got back into the truck to stay warm. The engine seemed fine when idling, so I decided to wait for a while. During this time, a car passed by. I quickly turned on my hazard lights, got out, and waved my arms to signal for help. The car stopped, and a kind man in a Toyota rolled down his window. I explained my situation and asked if I could use his phone. He let me use his phone, and I called my friend Alex for advice. He told me to call a local towing company, and he said he would come to pick me up. I called the towing company and requested assistance. The man in the Toyota seemed like a local since he had good cell reception. After I finished my calls, he handed me back the phone, and I thanked him. He asked if I was alone, and I hesitated for a moment before confirming that I was. He didn't say much and drove away. I watched his taillights vanish into the darkness. I was alone again, waiting in my truck. The headlights barely lit up the surroundings, and it was so dark that I couldn't see anything outside the windows. Time passed, and suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the passenger side window. I jumped in surprise and looked to see a figure outside. It was a man in a big black coat with the hood covering his head. He was begging for help, saying he was freezing and needed to get out of the cold. I was cautious and didn't know if I should trust him. I tried to see his face with my flashlight, but it was too dark. I asked him questions to make sure he wasn't a threat, but before I could get any answers, he started trying to open the locked door forcefully. He banged on the window and yelled, but something felt off. Following my instincts, I put the truck in drive and started moving. As I drove away, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Coming over a hill, I saw the reflection of taillights ahead. It was the same Toyota from earlier. I slowed down and saw footprints in the snow, indicating that the man outside had been the driver of that car. I kept driving, not wanting to be caught in a dangerous situation. After a few minutes, I spotted headlights approaching from the other side of the road. It was the tow truck Alex had sent. I signaled for him to stop, and he helped me attach the truck to the tow. He asked if the man outside had a weapon, and then we drove away. The Toyota never passed us, so maybe he had turned back. The tow truck driver dropped me off, and I joined Alex for our snowboarding weekend. The broken water pump in my truck caused the overheating, but it got fixed later. I eventually sold that truck, glad that I had trusted my instincts that night. I realized that the man outside could have been dangerous, and I was thankful I hadn't opened the door. It was an adventure I would never forget. Once upon a time, I finished my work at 11 p.m. and started driving back to my home. My house was quite far from the city, about 45 minutes away. I always liked these drives after work because the roads were quiet and peaceful, especially when I got closer to home. My home was far out, so the roads were usually empty. This one night, I was about 20 minutes away from home and took a familiar side road that led straight to my house. This road was a bit creepy at night. It was dimly lit, and the sides were covered with a thick forest. Sometimes it would get foggy, making it hard to see far ahead. But since I knew the road well and there were no turns, I never worried too much about visibility. As I was driving, I noticed a blinking light in the fog ahead. It was hard to tell how far it was or which side of the road it was on. I slowed down, and as I got closer, the light suddenly turned off. Out of nowhere, a small car pulled out from the side of the road and stopped right in front of me. I tried to brake, but I tapped the back of their car since I was so close. I was surprised by how suddenly it all happened. Both cars didn't seem to have much damage. Not knowing what to do, I got out of my car and stood beside it, waiting for the other driver to come out too. I saw movement inside their car, but I couldn't see clearly. A man finally got out of the other car and started walking towards me. He looked middle-aged and quite big. I asked if everything was okay, mentioning that he had pulled out quickly. He acted strangely, looking around and not making eye contact. After a moment, he said he was sorry. I was getting uncomfortable because of his odd behavior. I didn't want to be alone on an empty road with him. I told him our cars didn't have much damage, so I was going to continue driving home. But just as I was about to get back into my car, he asked me to wait. He said he wanted to check his car for damage before I left. I said okay, and stood next to my car while he pretended to inspect his car. It was weird because I had only tapped his back bumper. He walked around his car, even going to the passenger side. That's when I saw someone else getting up from the back seat and moving towards the door. I felt uneasy, so I quickly got into my car and locked the doors. The man and the person who had been in the back seat started waving their hands, telling me to stop. I panicked and drove around them, down the road. Through the fog, I could see their lights behind me for about 30 seconds, but then they disappeared. I stopped at a gas station about 5 minutes from my house and waited there. I wanted to make sure they weren't following me. After waiting for a while, I didn't see their car pass by, so I drove home. At the time, I didn't call the police because I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. But looking back, everything about that situation felt wrong. I still don't know what those people wanted, but I can't help but think something dangerous could have happened if I hadn't left in time. I wonder if I should have reported the incident, as part of me worries they might have targeted someone else. And so, I always remember that night, grateful that I trusted my instincts and got away from a potentially dangerous situation. When I was around 16 years old, I used to make a long drive from the city to my parents' house in the countryside about twice a month. The journey took around 2 hours, and most of it was on a quiet country road surrounded by fields. One night, while driving through this remote area, something strange and unsettling happened to me. It was getting dark as I drove, and I was used to this route by now. About an hour and a half of the drive was on this empty road with only fields and occasional farmhouses. I had never encountered any trouble before, so I felt safe on these familiar roads. As I was driving that night, I suddenly saw flashes of light up ahead. It caught my attention, and I realized something was off. I slowed down to avoid getting blinded by the bright lights. As I got closer, I noticed there were 4 people standing in a line across the road. It was strange because there were no cars around them, and there didn't seem to be any reason for them to be there. Curiosity and caution led me to drive at a slower pace. I could see that these people were wearing large white masks and standing with what looked like bats. One of them had something that was causing the flashes of light. I had heard stories about dangerous situations on roads like this, so my heart started racing. I knew I had to make a decision quickly. I could either slow down and hope they moved out of the way or speed up and try to pass through them. I chose the latter, not wanting to take any chances. I didn't have a way to protect myself, and my car was my only defense. So I pressed on the gas and aimed to get past them. As I approached, my heart pounded in my chest. These figures with their masks and bats were intimidating. I held my breath, hoping they would move. 2 of them managed to step aside just in time, and I drove through the gap they created. It was a tense moment, but I made it past without hitting them. After safely passing through, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw 2 of them running after my car, while the other 2 stayed behind. The fear and adrenaline were overwhelming. I didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but I knew I had to get away from them. I kept driving as fast as I could, my heart still racing from the encounter. The road seemed never-ending, and I felt relieved when I finally saw the lights of a town up ahead. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station where there were people around. I took a moment to catch my breath and reflect on what had just happened. I called a friend to share the experience, and they tried to reassure me that maybe it was just a prank or a misunderstanding. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in. It was a long night, and I eventually made it to my parents' house. I didn't tell them the full story, not wanting to worry them. As time passed, I tried to make sense of the situation. Why were those people there? What did they want? I couldn't find any logical explanation. Every time I drove down a similar road, the memory of that night would resurface, filling me with unease. The feeling was hard to shake, and it stayed with me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places.